Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar from the Pickering Group. My name is Russell Pickering. It's awesome to have you here today. Just seeing who's joining us, and people are piling into the webinar as we speak, so I'm going to do that thing as we kill time. But you can see our two esteemed panelists are already here and joining us today. So Suzi McAlpine, give us a wave. Hi, Suzi.
Hi, everybody.
And Harold Hillman. Hello, Harold.
Hello, everyone.
So awesome to have you here, both of you. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules here on the eve of turning into level 2. Also joining us in sound only is my colleague Ruth Spencer, who again will be running the questions and acting like a producer. So you'll see her picture, but you won't be seeing her beautiful face today. Hi, Ruth. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, she's there. All right, cool. Right, so we have almost 100 people already join us, which is awesome. So what I want to do, everybody, now that you're here and listening, let's just run over a few logistics in terms of how this next hour is going to play out. So we want you to be interactive with us, and one of the ways that you can do that is through your Q&A box. If you have questions for the panelists, and they are the experts, so please, please, please do ask questions. Feel free to pop those questions into that box. Ruth will collate them, and then at certain points, probably about 3 or 4 points throughout the next hour, we will pause and answer some of your questions. So if you have questions for the panelists, put them in the Q&A box. In the chat box, which is also there, you can open up your chat box, and look, Jane Chade has already said hello. Hello to the fabulous panelists.
Yes, hello, Jane.
And you can chat to all of the panelists, but you can also chat to all panelists and attendees if you click on the little blue box down the bottom. So if you choose all panelists and attendees now, and while we're just waiting for everybody to arrive, why don't you just put in where you are listening from right now in your chat box. So go ahead and type that in right now where you're listening from, and we'll just have a look and see who's online with us. Auckland, Alex from Auckland, Justin from the North Shore, Dunedin, Hamilton, Wellington, Auckland, Hamilton, Blenheim, Waiuku, Lower Hutt, Titirangi, Wellington, Napier.
Wow, look at that.
Blenheim, Epsom, Wellington, somebody from Manual. All right, good. Porirua.
Did I see Thailand?
Masterton, Grey Lynn.
Did I see Thailand?
Maybe. Was there a Thailand? Golden Bay, Freeman's Bay, and also a few friends. Wayne McNee from Auckland. G'day, Wayne. Tony Lees. G'day, Tony.
Wayne.
Great, awesome to see you. Awesome for you to be here. Daniel Barnes, hello Daniel, so great. So thank you for that. Okay, so let's get this thing underway. The topic today, of course, I probably should introduce myself. So if you don't know me, my name is Russell Pickering, and I run a company called the Pickering Group, which is the instigator of this. My business specializes in communication, business communication, spoken business communication. And I'm not an expert on leadership, but I know that a lot of the conversations that I've been having with my clients is about leadership heading into level 2. So I thought, why don't we pull together some really awesome panelists to give you, the listeners, dear audience, some great tips from their wealth of knowledge. So I'll introduce them to you in a second. But the topic today really is the end of the beginning, leadership into level 2 and beyond. We've heard a lot about crisis leadership, but now we're heading into a place where the initial crisis seems to be under control, and we're heading into a phase of rebuilding. And what does that mean for the way that we lead ourselves, but also the way that we lead our teams? Ruth is there. I've introduced Ruth. So I'm going to introduce to you Harold Hillman right now with his bio. Harold is Managing Director of Sigmoid Curve Consulting Group, specializing in frameworks and tools that help executive teams lead their organization through major change. Over the past 2 decades, Harold has coached prominent chief executives and their teams in the US, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. Harold holds a master's degree in education from Harvard and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. His first book, The Imposter Syndrome, which I have right here, was Whitcoul's Book of the Year. This is his second book, Fitting In and Standing Out. He can be found at drharoldhillman.com. And Harold, I do believe you've got another book on the way shortly on empathy.
What a wow! Thank you for that intro. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And I disagree with you, by the way, Russell. You are a leadership expert. I have worked with you for nearly a decade now. You have huge impact on leaders.
Thanks, Harold. I'll give you that $20 later, but that's awesome. So Suzi McAlpine, my other panelist, is an executive coach, leadership specialist, author of the award-winning leadership blog, The Leader's Digest, which is amazing. It's won a ton of international awards. Suzi provides a range of services as a leadership development specialist, including executive coaching, leadership workshops, leadership development programs. Suzi's experience includes being an executive search consultant, associate director, executive coach, and practice leader for a division of the world's largest HR consulting firm. And in 2019, she launched a blended online leadership program called The Leader's Map for organizations wishing to equip their emerging leaders with the necessary leadership capabilities for success. She can be found at SuziMcAlpine.com along with The Leader's Digest. Welcome, Suzi.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks, Russell.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome to have you both. All right, so let's get into these questions. So the dust is settled. We are emerging from our bubbles, hopefully. And we're kind of yearning to get back to our normal routines, or maybe some of us aren't. But the question is, so what now? So over the past few months, we've heard a lot about this crisis leadership, but what does leadership into the next phase look like? Now, the two themes that we're going to cover off today are leading yourself and leading others. But the first question I'm going to pose to both of you is something like this. It's no doubt you've had your ear to the ground over the past couple of months during lockdown. And so Suzi, we'll start with you. What are the key leadership themes that have been emerging from the conversations that you've been having with your clients as they look ahead to level 2 and beyond?
Yeah. There have been a couple of conversations that seem to pop up and topics that pop up almost every single conversation that I'm having with leaders. And the first is, how do I lead virtually? How do I lead remotely? And I think that, it talks to even how do we run, Zoom sessions? How do I connect and, lead remotely during this time? And related to that has been a real increase in well-being, which I think is a really important and positive step. So I think well-being is becoming front and center for a lot of leaders, not only for themselves, but also for their team. So those are the two themes that keep coming up from, when I speak to leaders. But also I think there's been a lot of reflection around, what is important, both on a personal level and a professional level and with teams. And so I think we were talking earlier, it's been a really reflective space. I know for me personally, I normally jump on a plane every week. And I have to say that not doing that has allowed some real space to start to contemplate some bigger questions. So I think the challenges around leading virtually and remotely and how do we connect and keep well-being front and center has been two themes that I've really noticed. I don't know. What about you, Harold?
Go ahead, Harold.
Yeah. I agree, Suzi. I've looked at it. I've experienced it. We all have. No one has been immune from the impact of the pandemic, some more directly than others. And so, at a very personal level, I'm immersed in a beautiful paradox. Where I'm about to experience my first ever write-off year, but I've never been happier. And a big part of that, I have been reflecting on this, and a big part of this is that it has caused me to stop. I was moving and running so fast and, just real activity or action-oriented, but not building in enough time for reflection and perspective. So it's probably going to be one of the best years of my life, and it has nothing to do with income. It has everything to do with the intimacy and the connection that I've experienced over the last little while. My clients are feeling the same thing in terms of the virtual world. There will be a new normal. People are already locking into it. Companies are and teams are around the fact that we can actually get, in some cases, more quality work done efficiently and effectively from home. And I think CEOs and senior executives have far more empathy now for those who require workplace flexibility. So I do agree with Suzi that part of that new norm is going to be the virtual connection, which I've loved. I've felt some real cool connection.
Yeah, it's interesting. There seems to be a balance to be struck here between the necessity of going back into organizations and having that social feeling again and being connected to your work colleagues and all of the political type building and understanding that happens from just being around people day to day, balanced by the incredible efficiency of being able to work from home and what that, for some people, not all people, has really given them. I know a few people I've talked to are kind of dreading going back into the office. So Suzi, how do you think for somebody heading back into an environment that, say, potentially kind of poo-poos the idea of virtual working a little bit, can still influence their ability to be able to take the best of this experience back in there with them?
Well, I think one of the most important things to do that is to really listen to your employees. I don't think it's a decision that you need to make autocratically. I think you mentioned some people will feel some anxiety to move back into workplaces where others just can't wait to get back. And so I think the most important thing is to have those conversations, to really listen and be open to seeing what different innovations can emerge, I think. So I think listening deeply to different perspectives of in your own direct reports and your teams is going to be really important for that.
Yeah, cool. Harold, thinking about just preparing in a very practical sense, and we'll do a poll on this in a second, just to get a gauge on how people are feeling, but in a very practical sense, heading back into, say you're going back into the office for the first time in a couple of months tomorrow, what would you be advising people to think about tonight if they were going back to a situation with their teams as leaders? What would you be suggesting?
It's on everybody's mind. It's top and center in terms of what leadership teams are talking about and what undoubtedly employees are focused on, and that is how to phase people back in. What I'm learning from my clients is that most companies are going to phase people back in sort of collective bubbles, ranging from 10, I'm not quite sure what the number is, but where they will bring people back in either 2 or 3 waves, so that you can also manage whether or not there's an outbreak. If someone comes down with coronavirus, it's much easier to maintain. So there's going to, I get the sense that people will not be back all people will not be back in the same workplace together until the end of the year, if not the top of 2021. That's my sense. And so virtual is for real, definitely through the end of this calendar year, if not into next year.
Suzi, is that also your experience?
Yeah, and I think what I've really noticed is that, pre-COVID-19, people would be pretty automatic to say we have to jump on a plane and all get together face to face. And I think what COVID-19 has done is it means that we don't react. We're not so reactionary at that. There are times when, once this is passed, we will get together face to face. But I don't think we have to necessarily do that. I think it's challenged some mental models around how we can work and what will work. And so I think there will be this new norm where we will see more different ways of connecting, which isn't just face to face. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, cool. Just to get a feel for the audience out there, I'm going to launch my first poll, which is, the question is, how are you feeling about heading back into your office or workplace if that is the case for you? This is anonymous, by the way. I know some of the answers on this would be reasonably sensitive. So this is an anonymous poll, so feel free to do it anonymously. Here we go. I'm launching that now. So that should just pop up for you. And go ahead. Are you seeing that, Ruth? Is that popped up? So can people see that?
Yep.
So go ahead and vote. So you can see there's a few scenarios here. I'm dreading it because of the uncertainty. I'm worried about my health or my family's health. I'm okay about it, but I've enjoyed elements of working from home. I'm okay about it, but I'm worried about the dynamics of my team. Bring it on. I'm stoked. I'm not going back in. My situation's changed. That's actually 12% of the people on this webinar today, they're not going back into the office. The situation's changed. I've already been back into level 3 or 4 is 13%. The majority seem okay about it. 3% are dreading it. 8% I'm worried about my health or my family's health, which is still significant. So why don't we deal with that question for a second? You know, this will be tentative for people who may, you know, their own health may be compromised. They might have family members who are in situations where their health is compromised. So Harold, what would be your advice to negotiating that space for people?
Yes, I'm wearing my psychologist hat here. I used to work in that realm of clinical psychology, anxiety. I know anxiety well, personally and professionally. It's human. And it has been revved up over the last 3 months, unlike anything that I've known in my life. And so with anxiety, people really need a little bit of space to work things out. And that really does require leaders to be a lot more empathetic as we move through the next few months. I hope that people realize that it's okay to be anxious. It revs us up around needing to react and respond to an unexpected threat. But at the same time, sometimes it can become overwhelming. And some people, roughly 18% of the population, experience anxiety disorder. So things are revved up right now. So if you are experiencing a bit of anxiety, and rightfully so, around spacing and is it too soon and not wanting to, you know, you're the only breadwinner at home, or you know, you're in a vulnerable group or whatever it may be, leaders need to be mindful that this is going to be a segue in across 6 to 8 months, likely, certainly into the new year, depending on how things track. And so be compassionate with yourself, and leaders, be compassionate with your teams, particularly for people who are really anxious about too close a physical distancing. It is always better to err on the side of people believing that they are your top priority.
And, you know, and that's really, really, really good advice. Suzi, what would you say to the person in the team who is trying to negotiate that, but there are certain parts of their leadership team who might have the attitude of, and this is actually some questions that have come from my clients, the attitude of, this has all just been completely overblown. You know, it was never anything worse than a bad cold. Believe it or not, this is something, you know, I've had stories of them heading back into work, people bowling in, their managers bowling in and taking on the attitude of, it is back to business as far as we're concerned. And also taking a very political line about it and being very strong in their political views to the point where they're making other people feel unsafe. What would be your advice to people in that situation, trying to deal with the over-eager manager, for want of a better word, or leader?
Yeah, well, I think when you talk about security, you've really got to be, as a leader, be really cognizant of not only physical safety. So I think the first thing is it say, you know, how can you create a space where people feel safe to go back to work? But I also think there's something really important around psychological safety. And so people need to feel that they can show up as themselves. And so I wouldn't get political is the first thing. But I think creating psychological safety is really focusing on trust within the group and allowing the space for people to be vulnerable. And the best way you can do that, I think, is to demonstrate a bit of that vulnerability yourself. So you can talk about your mistakes and your weaknesses. And I think, you know, I really support what Harold said, is you have to put people at the center of your daisy in terms of your leadership practice and people's safety, not only physically, but psychologically. I don't think it's either or, it's both. So that's what I would say. And I wouldn't, I certainly would be focusing on making sure that is a safe space for everybody. And if there are behaviors that are not creating safety, I wouldn't put up with it.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. Look, I'm going to bring the audience in here for a second. So audience, you can ask your questions, pose them to Ruth, and she'll frame them. So Ruth, just before I come to you, I'm just going to read a few of these comments so far. Mary writes, I read somewhere a saying, worry about what you can do, not what you can't, which is great. Wendy writes, our campus is breaking out into red-blue teams for weeks off and on in the office. Sarah writes, I suspect that the kind of management style will alienate people. Well, that kind of management style will alienate people in a small market like New Zealand. You will not become an employer/manager of choice. Not a good stance to take, and shows a lack of leadership confidence to allow the space for vulnerability and change. Ain't that true? Ruth, let's take a question from the audience.
Okay, an anonymous attendee asked, how can they appear positive to their team when they're not feeling that way themselves? And especially in the situation when you know more about the cost pressures the organisation is under, how can you balance that with being honest to your staff or your team?
All right. Harold, why don't we start with you with that one?
To reinforce what Suzi said, it's if you wear vulnerability well, some people wear vulnerability as a virtue, and some people wear it as a vice. This scenario has pulled us all out of our comfort zone because there is no expert. So people who need to be expert are likely to stress out a bit. So it's helpful for your team to be able to connect with you by them being able to see that you don't have everything nailed down. And that's fine. I think it's important to reinforce that as a leader, you don't need to be perfect to be effective. As a matter of fact, it's more important for you to be human and wonderfully imperfect. And so I think that a big part of it is, as a leader, letting people know that you understand, can feel what they're going through. In some cases, conveying it through compassion and things that just help people out. You don't want to go too far. There's such a thing as too vulnerable.
You don't want to be weeping uncontrollably in a big pool of tears. I agree, Harold.
That's right. So there's being wonderfully imperfect and human, and being to the point where people do need their leaders to project an optimism and a compelling energy. Positivity helps. Optimism really helps during a time like this. And so those are some top of mind things, Russell.
Yeah, cool. So Suzi, just to bring you in there, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned, is it, how can we, portray calm and optimism? And I think that's going to be really important and very challenging. I think there's this thing called the boss shadow effect, and I think many leaders underestimate the shadow that they cast. And I think that people will be acutely aware of leaders' reactions, and they're going to, in response to this, and they're going to take their cue from that. So I think it is really important to be aware of how you show up. And one practical thing I think you can do is that before you have an encounter, whether that's with your team or with a one-on-one, that you take a few moments before that to really ask yourself, how do I want to show up in this situation? What would me being my best leadership self in terms of optimism and calm, but also facing reality? I think also being aware of your non-verbal body language is really important. I mean, we communicate a lot through our expressions and our body language. So just being aware of that. And being aware of the sort of triggers, what I call the watch outs for yourself. So what are some of the things that might get you out of kilter of being calm and positive with your team? What are the things that might cause you to get angry or frustrated or, lose your cool? And before you go into that encounter, think, well, what are the things that I can do to really stop that? But also I think to answer your person's question, I think it's really important for you to have an objective sounding board, whether that's a peer or a mentor or a coach. You do need a safe place yourself as a leader to be able to vent or to talk through your worries. Just don't do that with the team that you lead. I think that's, as Harold said, I think there is something really infectious about optimism, but at the same time facing reality.
Yeah, and it seems to be about striking that balance, right? That balance about being empathetic, but also understanding people are going to be getting bad news, right?
Yeah.
And there's going to be a lot more bad news in the zeitgeist than there is positive stuff, and how that then goes on to affect your team, and you know, about creating that work environment where people can feel secure and they can thrive and they can flourish. Yeah. I suppose that becomes one of the big questions. Harold, did you want to talk a little bit about just in times of real uncertainty and real fear from a lot of people, how does that affect the way that people feel like they can thrive and flourish in their environments? And is there ways to balance that out?
It is. It's important to recognize and to understand that anxiety is human, and it is there for a purpose. And if there's ever been a time for it, it's now. So people are likely to be pulled downward and inward, insular. And so it is important whether you're talking about a family member, a next door neighbor, a team member. To just make sure that not only is your perspective lifted up and outward to be able to take in more information and just feel a little bit more energy and positivity. We've got a good news story going here in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. It will be, in terms of the next couple of years, we'll see the impact of all of this. We know that it's going to get worse before it gets better, but helping people see the long view. The long view infuses more energy. The short view usually absorbs a lot more stress. And so for yourself personally, lift your head up every now and then and look outward and look at the bigger picture, which is usually full of optimism, as opposed to being downward in your own mental models, which might be negative.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. You know, the first couple of weeks of this, where you just see your pipeline of work disappear. It's like, oh my, and you just think, I'm going to have to sell the Tesla. What am I going to do?
That's right. So, there's a bigger picture here.
Yeah, there's a bigger picture, right? But I found that I've shifted into being more optimism. When I look at New Zealand, I think, gosh, compared to so many other countries, we're in such a position to turn this very negative situation into something that could be quite extraordinary for us in the long term. You know, a real shift, and I hope that momentum is taken. I do want to just pivot slightly here to another thing that's come up around this idea of people being in lockdown, is that they have been finding themselves working actually much harder than they ever have. And often, you know, they're down many team members. They've had to, I know some of the people that I've been talking to, half of their team's been laid off. All of that work is now on them. They're all doing it from home by having to negotiate their families. They're about to go back into the situation, but they're feeling already this feeling of burnout. And I know certainly in areas that have been involved, still really working in a lot of the essential services, government services, people have just been working incredibly hard for the benefit of everybody. So Suzi, I know that you have a book coming out soon on burnout. Yeah. So what is your advice to people who are, feeling themselves on the cusp? How do they understand that they could be suffering, getting close to burnout? And what would be your advice to them?
Yeah, well, Russell, I think, it's a really interesting point you make. I don't think it will be unlikely that we will start to see over the coming weeks and months a greater range of and an increase in burnout. And I think that there are some things that leaders can do to really prevent burnout, not only in themselves, but those that they lead. And the first one is to recognise the signs of burnout. It doesn't tend to happen overnight. You don't just wake up one morning and you're feeling burnt out. It is a slow creep. But there are three really key I call red flags that people need to watch out for, which signal that they may be experiencing burnout. And the first one is exhaustion. Now, we're all probably feeling a bit exhausted at the moment. We're not talking about the tiredness that can be fixed by a holiday or a weekend away. This is sort of chronic long-term exhaustion, which means that even getting out of bed and facing work is really difficult. So it's sort of the extreme end of tiredness, that exhaustion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is an increased depersonalization, or this increased cynicism. So it might show up as, bitterness, or empathy drops, and, just like what Harold was mentioning, a sort of an emotional distancing. So that kind of depersonalization, that increased cynicism that perhaps wasn't there before, is a second flag. And the third thing is really a lack of professional inefficacy, or a lack of professional efficacy. So it's the sense of I can't accomplish anything at all anymore. So if you start to see those three things, I think the first thing is to recognize those burnout symptoms straight away. But I think there are a couple of other things that leaders can do to prevent it. One is to really focus on social connection. So one of the big causes of burnout is actually a sense of isolation. I know Harold mentioned that. So the sense of isolation is probably going to be increased. So be really purposeful about creating social connection in your teams. So this is about not just focusing on what we're doing, but how we're doing as well. And then the third thing is really looking at organizing, which could be prioritizing. So over the next 3 or 4 months, get really clear on the top 3 priorities for you and for your team. And we're not talking the top 10 or 15 priorities. I mean, that's an oxymoron. What can we ditch and delay? Don't give people tasks or projects without really exploring that they've got the resources to really create that. So I would be recognize, socialize, organize, and then destigmatize. But, that's another story altogether.
Ooh, the eyes is. Harold, did you have anything to add? Because I know you've talked about this topic before as well.
Yeah, so I would just say that in a time of crisis where the team has to move quickly, people give their leaders more latitude to be directive. And do not expect long consultative or consensus building conversations. Mm-hmm. It's a natural human response. And so now is the time to reinforce what Suzi said, to prioritize just a few things that give people a positive sense of momentum. Will make a huge difference, definitely.
Yeah, because that's an interesting idea, pulling that out, that idea of, in the course of an emergency or a crisis, there is a lot more of a need for that reactive type leadership where people are responding very quickly. You can't run it through 1,000 committees. You just need to make decisions fast. But at some point, you need to shift back to that consensus making, right? Where the long-term benefits of decisions. So how do you recognize that point, Harold, where you need to turn back to that? Is there a point that you look out for where you think, okay, and how do you know when your team's had enough of you telling them what to do and they want some say?
Yeah, it is.
You see that pushback happening right now in politics, right? You can see that.
You do. It's a bit intuitive. It's on that sense of things that just are urgent, and you have enough experience there. We trust that you can make this decision. There's a lot on. We don't need to get immersed in a 3-hour conversation in that. Just go ahead and do it. Just make those decisions, and people give more latitude. Even in a directive mode, you still have to, you don't want to be a dictator. So the idea is that people need to perceive that they are helping you think. You're the commander, so make the decision. We get it. But always remember that it is important to keep connected to people so that you get their hopes, worries, concerns, fears, those types of things, but move quicker. When we get back into on the other side of this, particularly around big picture or big leverage things that have now shifted the business, and we're going to have to alter our business model because of this. it will require to get people's heads and hearts in this new place longer, more intricate conversations with folks. It reinforces situational leadership, and you move up and down that dial depending on what the scenario is. And so right now we're in a directive mode. Go for it, make it work. It actually can mitigate anxiety if you are the commander at the helm. But 6 months from now, when we're rebuilding, you got to bring people back into the conversation.
Yeah, cool. Just a message from Leanne. Please, can Suzi repeat the organize, socialize, prioritize? I think there was another one. Was there another one there?
Yeah, so the first thing is to recognize the symptoms of burnout. The second one, which I didn't go into, is destigmatize. And that's really important for all mental distress, actually, and there's some tips. The third one is socialize, so that's really around social connection. And the fourth one is organize, which could also be around prioritization. So those are the 4 I's, which you can read more about in my book next year. When it comes.
And a bookstore near you.
And a bookstore near you. Me and Harold will do we'll do a double-bench one. Yeah,
I will.
Ruth, we'll come to you in a moment, Ruth. I've just got a couple of comments here. Tanya Hawkins writes, we're reminding our people that challenging times can often be where great ideas and innovation happen. We are encouraging out-of-the-box thinking because our changed operating models need us to, and L&D thrives in ambiguous and agile environments. Wayne McNee writes, McKinsey just published an article about the optimistic leader, but as you have noted, authenticity is also important. I've been reading widely about the economic impact, and most of the analysis is extremely negative. Yeah. So while our company is in good shape, the long view may be very long. It's a very challenging balance. Ruth, let's come back to you for a couple of questions from the audience.
I have a couple of people who would like to know about split teams. What happens in level 2 if you've got some people working from home and some people working in the office, and how do you manage that without leaving any group out or feeling left out?
So is there a volunteer who'd like to answer that one?
Well, look, it's a theory I've been building in my head. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people writing about this over the next couple of months. Pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, there would sometimes be someone on the screen or 2 people. The majority of the team was in the room. And there were 2 people who lived in another city who couldn't be there. Mm-hmm. And that was an awkward dynamic. It was almost like you had to sort of like really work because the true dynamic was right there in the room. And you had to like sort of incorporate those folks. So my sense is that, and what my experience is telling me is that it's either all or none, in the sense of there'll be times when someone has to work from home for the various reasons, and I do believe that workplace flex is going to happen. But over the next little while, either you're in the office or you're all virtually. But this notion of 2 people on the screen and 8 in the room, the dynamic that I believe is going to be then prevalent is people around the table and the people on the screen are peripheral. Over the last 6 weeks, we've all been central and core to the dynamic on the screen, and it makes a big difference, I think.
Another question, Ruth, from the audience?
An anonymous attendee would like to ask if anyone would like to comment on the leadership model in the USA at the moment. And I know you've got something to say about that, Russell, yourself.
Oh, Suzi, let me frame.
No comment. I think it probably talks a little bit about our reaction just there, but that's. I just want to talk to something earlier that someone said around innovation. So I don't need to say that now because I think it's important to answer that question. But just remind me, because I'll otherwise forget about that whole thing around innovation.
Okay, let me spin this a little bit from from what's going on in the States, which is you're watching that. What seems to be is very interesting. You see coming out a few memes around, it seems, and I'm not sure if this is evidence based, but the memes have basically said that in terms of women in leadership, the countries that are doing well under women in leadership and the countries that are doing well under kind of strong men nationalistic leaders, it's the female leadership that tends to have right now better outcomes for a population and a population's health. How does this play out in terms of your experience with leadership in organizations? Suzi, should we start with you on that?
Well, I think rather than women and men, I think what is starting to emerge is that some of those leadership traits that have been traditionally associated with women, so compassion, collaboration, which men and women can both demonstrate, are starting to come to the fore as being really important in this time. I think what made a good leader pre-crisis, there are lots of things that will make a good leader post-crisis, but there are 4 things that I think that are really coming to the fore. And I think they might be seen as feminine leadership, but I think they're important for all leaders. One is empathy and compassion. I know that's been a real theme, but I think treating people humanely, showing you care, putting people at the center of the daisy is really important. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is really trust. I think people want to trust our leaders. And so you're seeing this variation of trust across the globe. But when we're talking about trust, I think good leaders are focusing on trust, not just, there's affective and cognitive trust. So affective is, warmth, emotional bond, interpersonal relatedness. And so you're seeing some leaders really demonstrate that and others not. But it's important also, I think, to look at cognitive trust. So that really talks about, can I rely on this person? Is this person competent? So what I would say good leaders are doing right now is making their intentions crystal clear. So being really transparent about your decisions, your communications, about your intentions. And I think that's really important. So I won't specifically comment about which countries are doing that or which aren't. But the other thing is around getting comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing. And without talking about specific leaders, I think good leaders are getting comfortable with that discomfort, and that can be really challenging for lots of leaders. I think there's this expectation that leaders have to have all the answers, that they need to know everything. Well, that's just not going to be possible in this complex and ambiguous environment. So I think if you can muscle up on that will be really important.
That's right, because there's no playbook for this, right? This is, nobody can say, oh, well, I've been through a situation like this, so here is what you need to be doing. And that uncertainty plays a huge part in the idea that the decisions that you will be making as a leader now, Harold, I'll direct this one to you. You will be remembered for these decisions, won't you? People will remember the decisions you make in this time and how that affects people. That's right.
Look, it's Maya Angelou. The Nobel laureate African-American poet, her famous for her quote, which is, I may not remember your name or what you do, but I'll always remember how you made me feel. And that's what's going on right now. That's where EQ, to reinforce what Suzi said, emotional intelligence. 25 years ago, Daniel Goleman wrote the book, Emotional Intelligence. And I'm old enough to remember standing in front of a group of managers who said, oh, it's a passing fad. And here it is 25 years later, and it is real. And his premise was, in 2 decades, EQ is going to be more important than IQ, both professionally and personally. And here we are. And I think it's playing itself out. So this is a real awakening around the importance of human connection.
Another really interesting idea that I latched onto in my reading in preparation for this topic was the idea of how the modeling of good, ethical, emotionally intelligent leadership affects the followers and provides models for other leaders to mimic. And there was a really interesting article that noted, whatever your view of Jacinda Ardern, undoubtedly during this crisis, her leadership and communication leadership has been extraordinary, like an absolute textbook of what to do. And the argument was made, Suzi, I'll direct this to you, that by providing models for ethical leadership, it gives inspiration to ethical followers who therefore then ignite other forms of ethical leadership? Because it seems to me that compassionate ethical leadership is what the world needs a little bit more of right now in certain parts of the world, right?
Yeah, look, I believe now more than ever people are really looking to leaders to demonstrate values-based leadership and ethics. And this is where I think that it would be really important to get really clear on what your values are at the moment. I think get very clear about what do I value, and then every day try and lead by those values. You're not always, you're going to come up short, but I think to be really clear about what those values are going to really help you in terms of ethics. If you're feeling uncomfortable about something you're saying or doing, then you've got to listen to that. I think that's a chance to lean in, and if it's a choice between doing what's easy or what's courageous and right, we're not always going to get it right, but I think leaders have to really strive to do that. Yeah, I mean, I had an example about this talks about keeping your promises. I think is something that we should talk about in terms of ethics, and it's hard to do. I think you have to be really careful what you're promising to people at the moment. The other day, when lockdown started, I had an experience of that with my 11-year-old. I said to her, okay, every day at 4 p.m. we're going to go for a walk together, and I didn't really think much about my promise. And she said, are you sure? Well, of course, a week later, and it's raining and blustery and it's terrible, and here she turns up at 4 o'clock and says, okay, we're ready to go for our walk. And I'm like, are you kidding? We're not going to do that. And she looked at me and she said, hang on a minute, you are not keeping your promises, and I'm not going to trust anything you do. So don't do what I do, keep your promises. That's just one simple thing I think that people can do in terms of their ethical leadership.
Yeah, and if you don't know, admit you don't know, right? To say so.
Totally, absolutely.
Yeah, look, and just in terms of this philosophical idea of emerging leadership, I just wanted to run this one. I found this fabulous, really interesting article in the New York Times about Condé Nast and Anna Wintour, and she was under, she's under a hell of a lot of pressure, Anna Wintour at the moment, because of how she framed her leadership prior to the crisis. She was one of the last amongst her field of fashion to let her teams go and work from home. In Paris, she turned up at the runways. She was very stoic in her approach. And then when they got back to New York and everybody else was working from home, she kept her team in the Condé Nast offices till finally the mayor shut everything down. And then at that point, she sent people home, and she's been criticized for this. And I'll just read you this quote and get your opinion on it, which I think is interesting, right? There is the theatrical flourishes and lavish lifestyles of the great media figures of a generation, from Miss Wintour to Donald Trump, seem ill-suited to the moment. These days, even the most charismatic executives are doing Zoom calls in their sweatpants. Paris, rather than becoming a moment when Miss Wintour saved her treasured industries, magazines and fashion, now looks a bit like the last stand of her leadership style, for a personal brand larger than her company's and for Condé Nast's long, legendary 20th century. What do you think are, and I think it's really interesting, right? The models of leadership that may have been fit for purpose in a pre-COVID world are now being exposed as maybe not fit for purpose. What do you think is going to emerge out of this as for better or for worse? So Harold, what in terms of models of leadership, what do you think will be the trends that will emerge? I know you talked about emotional intelligence. Yeah. That's one. Do you think there are others?
Well, I think in the current context of what's going on globally, narcissism certainly will be exposed. I will look for any opportunity to make a contrast between what's going on in my beloved, home nation and my new home nation. I am so proud of New Zealand. I am so proud of New Zealand. I'm not a political person. I'm reasonable, and I tend to be a moderate. I don't get dug into the trenches. But we have unified here in this nation in a way, and with Jacinda Ardern at the helm, but unified behind Parliament and at local government, compared to, which makes a difference in our confidence, our optimism, our sense of momentum, compared to the US, where it's been a narcissistic, daily thing. I know this is not a Donald Trump thing, so I'll end there. But other than other than saying that, now more than ever, the world needs to really contrast the significance of empathetic leadership, connected to the people, as opposed to narcissistic leadership, related to how much power can I maintain in this crisis. And we're seeing it play out.
Here. Ruth, we'll just grab a couple of questions before we've got 10 minutes left. So let's grab a few more questions. Then I've got a few more questions myself just around self-leadership before we wrap it up for the evening. So Ruth, a few more questions from the audience.
Okay, for many people, this is a self-leadership question. If your willpower and your self-control have slipped a bit during lockdown, are there effective ways to boost and support a return to form?
Speaking from a friend. All right, Susie, we're going to pass this one over to you, he says, as he tries to breathe in his tight jeans.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I think that's such a great question who's asked that, because I think, I don't think there's anybody in the current climate which hasn't had a slip up. So I think the first thing is self-compassion. But then we talk to vulnerability. I think the first thing is, if you are feeling guilty, if you have made a slip up, apologize. This talks to vulnerability. I think the best leaders say, I was wrong, I made a mistake, you're better at this than I am. This is something that I'm working on and I will do better. I think that's the first thing that you need to do. But it's also about looking at what was going on for me to slip up in the first place. And usually it's because we're reacting versus responding. So all of those things around managing your own emotions, taking a deep breath, reflecting is really important. So I think that's that vulnerability, is you need to rock up and say, I'm sorry, I stuffed up, and this is what I'm going to do better. And when we talk about apologies, it's not, I'm sorry you felt bad about that. Brene Brown did a great post on LinkedIn recently about what makes a great apology. So I would start with that. I would get really curious. I think curiosity is going to be a really important trait, because I think that when we are curious, it helps us navigate those times. But get curious about your own self-awareness. What was it that tend to be my watch outs? What are my things that are going to cause me to get back into that state again? And go back to your values and really start to say every morning, what do I need to do to show up to demonstrate those values? And then at the end of the day, reflect, how did I go? How did I rank myself? Where did I do really well? And where do I need to do better?
Yeah, and that kind of leads into goal setting, Harold, and I'll pass to you on this one. Is there any particular technique in terms of setting good, achievable, concrete goals for yourself in a very uncertain future when you're looking ahead? Because I know for me, certainly, that idea of having things to focus on and things to look forward to is very important. Harold?
It is. And to reinforce what Susie said earlier, it is important to establish some goals. Goals help, particularly in the midst of uncertainty where there can be a lot of negativity. But don't select 100 goals. 3 make a difference. 3 make it. There's the rule of 3 and the power of 3. The human psyche resonates around 3. So set yourself a few goals that stretch you and keep you focused, a sense of momentum, things that are attainable, achievable. It may be looking for a new job. It may be needing to adjust to care for someone now who is particularly vulnerable in the midst of this whole general thing. It may be vocational. Each and every one of us can think of a few things that we probably need to do to give our whole psyche a sense of momentum, positive momentum, and positivity.
Yeah.
Positivity. Yeah.
Can I just I love what Harold says that about positivity and momentum. And I think one of the things that we can do is to catch people doing well, to give positive, specific, valuing feedback, and you know, and it might be around behaviors, it might be you know, around achievements, but catch people doing well. I think, you know, that just valuing specific feedback to people on their goal attainment is really good. I love what you just said there, Harold, about, you know, goals, you know, and small goals.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to put the two of you on the spot now. Susie, we'll come back to you. What are your goals? You've got some goals for yourself over the next, well, I know you're going to finish your book.
Yeah, so I have a couple of goals. My biggest goal right now is to finish my manuscript. It's due to the publishers in September. And so I would like to get there without being burnt out. That would be really good. But I've also got a personal goal. My husband has helped me set a goal running, and we're running 6Ks. This weekend we're going to do 8Ks. Just about kills me, but I've got a little goal like that. And then my other goal is not to let my 11-year-old daughter down by letting her down on not going for a walk every day. So that would be it. Those would be my big ones.
Yeah, nice. Harold, do you have some goals in mind for yourself?
Yeah. So the book is like, you know, there's never been a better time to write a book called Empathy, Making It Real for Leaders. And so I'm 7 chapters into what will be 13, and I'm on fire. And again, oddly enough, in a year where, again, just like you and Susie, it has impacted us significantly. I've never been happier and more energized. And so that's one goal. I want to take a long train ride, a 12-hour train ride to Wellington.
Oh, great.
I love to ride on the train, and I missed the train. And I got to get back on the train and just let the scenery go by. So I can't wait for us to be able to do that. That's one of the things I'm going to do. And I'm loving the reconnection with my daughters. They lost their mother, my ex-wife, in January. And since then, we have really connected in a beautiful way, daily, every other day. My grandsons, the power of connection. I didn't realize how hard I was working. I didn't realize how hard I was working. And so money is less important than the energy that I get from human connection.
Oh, look, I think that's a lovely place to wrap things up. Look, thank you so much, Susie. Thank you so much, Harold, for your energy, your advice, your wisdom that you've brought to the conversation today. Just really appreciate it. Thank you to Ruth for running questions for us in the background, and you being the producer and being awesome. Thank you for all of the wonderful webinar guests that we still have many online with us still here. Thank you all so much for spending your evening on the eve before level 2 with us. Just to recap, it seems the major themes that are coming out of this are, yes, it's going to be tough, but it doesn't mean that we can't be human. We can still be empathetic. We can still be passionate. We can still connect with people. We can not try and pretend that everything's okay, but admit our faults when we see them. We can listen to people more deeply. We can go into our teams and be optimistic and find a sense of journey through careful planning and through careful and through hope, a sense of hope and a sense of optimism that, from a perspective, we are in a really, really great place right now here in New Zealand. Despite the difficulty that lies ahead, perhaps we can move through that with grace and with as much ease as possible and come out the other side better and more amazing and more interesting and more awesome than we already are. So on that note, I think I will leave you all to it. We've got 2 minutes before the end. So good night, everyone. Good night. And thank you so much again. Thank you very, very much. And I'll be in touch with you all shortly. This has been recorded, so I will send this out as a recording to you tomorrow. Feel free to pass it on, or feel free to give it to your friends who haven't seen it. You can find Harold at drharoldhillman.com. You can find Susie in the Leaders Digest at SuziMcAlpine.com, and that's the dog just come in. And of course, finally, it's like typical. Andrew's like, my job's done. And of course, you can find me and the Pickering group at thepickeringgroup.com.
Thank you so much, Russell and Harold. What a wonderful way. Lovely.
Suzi, lovely to meet you.
Same to you. Same to you.
See you,
guys.
everyone.
Take
Thank
care.
you so much. Bye.